It is my privilege to introduce Wade Roush. Wade Roush. I mentioned he is a science journalist, has a BA at Harvard in the history of science, and a doctorate in the history of a doctorate in the history and social study of science and technology from MIT's program in science, technology, and society. He was, in fact, the very first one to complete this PhD program in 1994. And he has his involvement with MIT did not stop there, of course. In 2001, he joined Technology Review, and in 2014 to 2015, he was acting director of the Knight Science Journalism program at MIT. He has been he was chief producer and fundraiser for Science Writers 2015, and has also served as a research associate in the program of Science, Technology, and Society. 2017, he assembled and edited 12 Tomorrows, an anthology of hard science fiction stories that was published by the MIT Press. And he's also written an MIT Press book, Extraterrestrials. And he has been, you've heard him on WBUR, WHYY. He has a podcast, Soonish, and he continues to work with, he's a founding producer of a twice monthly podcast from the MIT Technology Review, Deep Tech, which is currently hosted by the Technology Review editor-in-chief, Gordon Litchfield. So with that, I would like to, I will hand the podium over to Wade to introduce our main speaker, Jean-Jacques. Oh, and before I forget, just a reminder, if you have any questions for our speakers, please put them in the Q&A box instead of the chat. And thank you, and over to you, Wade.
Great, thank you so much, Megan. That was a really nice introduction. And I'll be introducing Jean-Jacques, and we'll be having a bit of a conversation, and then I will be moderating the Q&A. So Megan's going to feed the questions to me, and I'll relay them to Jean-Jacques. So definitely start picking up questions that you'd like to have in front of Jean-Jacques. So let me start off with a few words about our guest of honor, who you'll see just a second from now. Jean-Jacques Degroof grew up in Belgium. He worked in asset management for a firm that had been in his family for multiple generations. Then he came to MIT and earned a master's in management from Sloan in 1993, and then a PhD also from Sloan in 2002. Jean-Jacques' dissertation work focused on how university-based innovation can help old economy regions, such as Belgium, that historically don't necessarily have a strong culture of entrepreneurship. After getting his PhD, Jean-Jacques continued to study the impact of universities on their local economies. He did that at the Industrial Performance Center at MIT, led by Professor Richard Lester, and also at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. He also began working directly with science-based startups to help them commercialize their products. Eventually, he returned to Europe, where he has since put in a lot of effort, kind of trying to nudge European countries toward a slightly more American, perhaps, style of innovation with more growth-oriented startups and more risk-friendly investors on the venture side. Jean-Jacques probably would agree that he may have had mixed success there because much of Europe remains, I think, stuck in a somewhat outdated way of thinking about academic entrepreneurship and how it should be supported. But Jean-Jacques kept coming back to MIT for periodic revisits, right, that helped to kind of renew his enthusiasm for entrepreneurship and his energy. And eventually he decided to write a book trying to get at what people at MIT really mean when they say things like entrepreneurship is in our DNA. What DNA? You know, what does that mean to really say that? So the book that he published this year from the MIT Press is what we're here to talk about today. It's From the Basement to the Dome, How MIT's Unique Culture Created a Thriving Entrepreneurial Community. So Jean-Jacques, welcome. and thanks for joining us so late in the day. I know it's almost midnight there in Belgium, so thank you. I'd like to start by asking you about the title of the book. So, From the Basement to the Dome. You know, everybody who's been to MIT knows that there is this extensive network of tunnels underground at MIT. So that's the basement. And of course, everyone's familiar with the iconic dome over Lobby 10. But how is it that that title speaks to the theme here of your book? And it might sound like that's a very narrow question about how you come up with the title, but really I want to give you a platform here to explain the whole premise of the book and maybe just summarize the book.
Yes, thank you, Wade, and thank you for the MIT Club of Boston to host me. Yes, the title is a metaphor, actually, and I try to encapsulate in this title the story of the book. So what's the story in a nutshell? Interest in entrepreneurship started in the late 60s, early 70s, and then years thereafter with initiatives of alumni, students, individual faculty members, and staff members, mostly, if not exclusively, in the extracurricular activities. So not really at the core of the institution. And it developed over the years in an uncoordinated way. It was scattered all over the campus, and most of the time the organizers were not aware of each other. It took the form of business plan competitions, student clubs, mentoring activities, conferences, etc. And in the beginning, in the early days, people literally met in the basement of campus to brainstorm about their ideas and work on their projects. So, and over the years, entrepreneurship grew this way. It's in a bottom-up process, uncoordinated, relatively at the periphery of the institution. And that's the basement part of the story. So the question that comes up to mind immediately is that how is it possible that it developed this way and at this scale? Because by 2013, it was estimated that 3,000 students were taking part in extracurricular activities related to entrepreneurship. By then, there was like 50 classes of entrepreneurship. And my argument, and the thesis of my book is that it managed to grow this way because it was driven by MIT's strong mens et manus culture. And in particular, some elements of this culture, such as that were fitted very well with entrepreneurship, like excellence, problem solving, experimentation, the desire to have an impact on the world. Then in the early 2010, the MIT leadership launched the Innovation Initiative, through which it embraced entrepreneurship in a more formal way and made it a pillar of the institution along with education and
we may have
research.
We have a frozen screen from Jean-Jacques at the
Oh.
We are still hearing Jean-Jacques. Please continue.
Okay, good. So that's in a nutshell the story of the book and of the title.
Okay. How did you come to write this book, Jean-Jacques? I mean, I'd like to hear you talk about how you came to believe that a book like this would be useful, and then why you decided to write it yourself.
Yes. Well, when I was on campus in the 90s, I went to all the events related to entrepreneurship. And when I thought I knew all of them, I realized there were others. And then again, the same thing repeated itself. So I was puzzled. So how could this work? And as entrepreneurship grew over the years, the puzzle grew also in my mind. And that led me to the decision to write this book, because I thought someone should tell the world this story. There was a second motivation. Over the years, I saw delegations of decision makers from all over the world visiting MIT to try to understand, what is the secret sauce of this entrepreneurial ecosystem. And going home, I believe, with little understanding, but indeed it's normal. It's quite a complicated thing. So I also wrote the book with this audience in mind, trying to explain what the secret sauce is, or at least some of its ingredients, without, however, presenting MIT as a model to copy and paste. And finally, alluding to what you said earlier, I wanted to go beyond the narrative that I was hearing at MIT, saying that entrepreneurship is in our culture, it's in our DNA. But I thought, well, once you've said that, you have not really improved your understanding, and I wanted to dig into this.
Right, of course. What are we really talking about here? Could you give us a favorite example of an entrepreneur or perhaps a company that emerged out of MIT, and talk about how the bottom-up process by which MIT fosters innovation and entrepreneurship, how did that actually work in a specific case? Do you have a favorite kind of story about that?
Well, I have many favorite stories, but one that I'd like to share with you today is not really the story of a company, but it's the story of the students who launched what was then the 10K business plan competition. It was, so in the 1988, students launched the entrepreneurship club. Students from the School of Engineering, and around the same time, interestingly, students at Sloan launched the Sloan Venture Association. I'm sorry, I'm a bit stumbling on the name. And eventually the two groups merged, and they thought, how could we give visibility to our initiative, which was really very marginal and low-key and small scale. And they came up with the idea of organizing a business plan competition. So they started to lobby the Dean of Engineering and the Dean of the Sloan School, and approach alumni to get support, sponsoring, some money, space, etc. They also approached companies in the Boston area, and then one thing leading to another, in spite of some resistance and in the beginning, and so they managed a year later to launch the 10K business plan competition. Why 10K, by the way? Because supposedly it was the price for filing a patent back then. And it was exceptionally and unexpectedly successful, because depending on sources, 50 to 60 teams participated, which was unexpected. Then the students felt the need to have some training in writing business plans. So they approached one of their mentor, an alumnus called Joe Adzima, who to ask them to teach his a class about business plans during IAP. And Joe hesitated, said that he would think about it, and the students put his name on the IAP catalog and the title of the class. So in other words, they twisted his arm. And one of the students told me we went by a motto that was quite widespread among students back then, consisting of saying, ask for forgiveness, not for permission. And so you know the story, everybody knows the story of the 10K competition, which then became the 50K enterprise competition, then today the 100K. And today, on average, 1,000 students participate in the 100K in 250 teams. The model has been copied all over the world. It's a huge success. So it's, why am I choosing this story? Because I think it's representative of the process that has been going on over the years of entrepreneurial students in this case, but it could be alumni or staff members, faculty members who pursued their dream and made it. And this little seed that they planted, sometimes, like in this case of the business plan competition, produced a big forest in the end. And I think it illustrates this entrepreneurial spirit that has been at the root of many initiatives related to entrepreneurship at MIT.
Right, right. That's a classic story of the forest growing up from the seed. But I want to explore this a little further, and I'd like to put a personal opinion out on the table and ask you to react to it, Jean-Jacques. So I think your book does a great job of documenting how over decades, when it came to how MIT was going to support tech transfer or faculty-led entrepreneurship or student-led entrepreneurship, things bubbled up from the bottom, right? MIT, for the most part, took a hands-off, somewhat laissez-faire approach, and it signed on for specific things like the 10K or providing some writing advice, but it was very much a bottom-up operation. If you were feeling a little more critical, you might, instead of saying bottom-up, you might say scattered, you might say rudderless, and you might attribute the success to the effort of the students rather than to any consistent attention on MIT's part. And I think what's happened in the years since then is that MIT has been getting sort of a little more focused and has devoted a little more concerted investment and action to supporting innovation and entrepreneurship on campus, with the result that more and more value has been created and more innovation has happened and more companies have been thriving around Kendall Square and Cambridge and Massachusetts. And so it feels to me like, there's something to be said for decentralization, but there's also a really strong argument for the idea that when MIT pays attention to entrepreneurship, that's when things really start firing. So do you think both things can be true? And if so, when and why does focused attention for MIT also matter in all of this?
Well, I think we have to take two things into account to appreciate this alternative or these two approaches. One is that the bottom-up development of interest in entrepreneurship at MIT, you said mainly from students, but that is not totally true. The students were indeed major actors, but also alumni and individual staff members and faculty members played a critical role at various times. This bottom-up process that characterizes the development of interest in entrepreneurship is the point is that it's very consistent. It's quite consistent with the way MIT operates, which is it's also a bottom-up organization. Not that it doesn't have structure or hierarchy, but it's quite decentralized, and there is quite a lot of autonomy in its components. So I think. At least it was consistent with the culture. Second, I think we have to make a difference between entrepreneurship like in the 90s, right? So, and today. So in the meantime, it has become a much bigger phenomenon. And when sort of the laissez-faire approach was appropriate, was possible in the 90s or earlier, when the phenomenon was quite small and limited, it's probably difficult to just only have this kind of bottom-up approach and laissez-faire approach today, when you have like more than 80 extracurricular activities related to entrepreneurship, more than 60 classes. So the number are huge, and also the students have realized since the financial crisis, I think that, and that's a big change, that entrepreneurship since then and for the first time is really, for a critical mass of students, has become a credible career path. So I think it's justify a little bit more structure nowadays. But of course, the challenge is not to kill the creativity of the bottom-up spontaneity with top-down initiative. The challenge is to balance, combine the two.
Yeah, well, speaking of structure, there is a ton of structure, like in some cases, literal structures coming into place right now. I wanted to mention the physical transformation on Main Street, for example. There's a new building called Innovation HQ, former Building 38, that now is home to the Student Innovator Lounge, the Voxel Lab, the Sandbox Innovation Fund, the Student Venture Studio, the Legatum Center for Development and Entrepreneurship, the Alumni Venture Studio, the Deshpande Center for Technological Innovation, the New England I-Corps, and the MIT Innovation Initiative, all in the same building. And then just down at the other end of Main Street, you've got the Engine, which is MIT's MIT-supported venture capital fund, which is renovating a former Polaroid warehouse into a vast new sort of 100,000 square foot lab and office space facility. So really, the whole look of Kendall Square is changing, and it's being rebuilt to accommodate the whole idea, I think, to accelerate the idea that the ideas coming out of MIT can be built into big businesses. So I wanted to ask you, what do you think is the importance of all of that, of giving more physical space to these initiatives and locating them together and putting them right in the heart of Kendall Square? Do you think that's, on the whole, a promising development, or is there a danger that you might kill the golden goose with a little too much attention and too much of a spotlight or too much structure?
Well, as we know, space has always been a scarce commodity on MIT's campus. So giving space to these initiatives related to entrepreneurship innovation is a good support and is probably a strong statement as well for entrepreneurship and innovation, and positioning them in the new gateway to the campus, the East Gateway, Kendall Square, especially, I think is also a strong statement, a strong endorsement, and a strong message both internally and to the rest of the world.
So that's all true, absolutely. I had a slightly different question, Jean-Jacques, and it's really about the larger world outside of MIT and outside of Kendall Square. So MIT doesn't operate in a vacuum. For one thing, it has to compete for undergraduates and graduate students with other top science and engineering schools. Especially, I think it's clear it has to compete with Stanford on the other coast. To what extent do you think have efforts like the Innovation Initiative at MIT been designed sort of with the implicit goal, if not the explicit goal, of making sure that budding young entrepreneurs do see MIT as a viable place to start their careers and don't automatically go off to Stanford and then slide right into jobs in Silicon Valley?
Yes. Well, it's clear that there is an appeal of Silicon Valley especially for young people and your young graduates in engineering and science, etc. There was a time in the late 2000s when indeed graduates, lots of graduates graduated and went to California to set up their venture. Definitely Silicon Valley had a strong and still has a strong appeal. Let me go back to what I said earlier. With the financial crisis in 2008-9, traditional employers stopped hiring, and so the risk for graduates of joining a startup became much lower. But also there were technology developments around these years that made it more attractive and exciting. Actually, the students realized, I think, that the center of gravity of the world was moving towards the technology sector. And for the first time, entrepreneurship became a credible career path. And of course, Silicon Valley is the center of the world in terms of entrepreneurship and technology. So it's true that MIT needed to offer the training and support to prepare for this new kind of career. And I think indeed the innovation initiative followed in part this logic.
Okay, great. So clearly MIT is thinking all the time about how it can position itself to always be a leading player in innovation. And I think it is always kind of paying attention to the competition and triangulating, trying to figure out what are the specific advantages that we can offer here in the Massachusetts innovation ecosystem. So it does seem to me that MIT-based entrepreneurship is much bigger than it was 10, 20, or 30 years ago. It's a huge operation now. It's advancing on many different fronts. But the story feels like it's not over, right? It's not 100% clear whether the Institute can transform itself into a sort of permanent launching pad for successful new technology businesses. These are all experiments, right? In my mind, for example, it's still kind of a big question what Kendall Square will look like once the pandemic is over. And the question of like all of these big skyscrapers that are now lined up along Main Street, and will they actually be filled up with innovators and entrepreneurs? How many people will ever want to work in these big buildings? There's plenty of lab space, but there's also a lot of new office space opening up. And will those offices get filled up? I guess what I really want to ask you is, do you feel like this story is over, or what do you think are the biggest open questions? And what does MIT still, what could MIT still stand to get better at when it comes to fostering innovation and entrepreneurship?
Yeah, of course, the story is not over. I think one challenge is because, as you said, entrepreneurship has become much bigger than 10, 20 years ago. There is also a need to manage potential conflicts of interests. there are many more contact points between MIT and the outside world, contacts with industry, with financiers, and so on. And it's really important to have good guidelines of engagement with the students to avoid conflicts of interest. It's important that students be clear about what the role of their professor or mentors are. And it's important that their role is educational, clearly educational, and provide a safe space to the students to make mistakes and produce their early ideas and so on. So I think that's a challenge of these times and for the future. I think there is also the debate about the necessity of having seed funds within, to fund early projects of certain entities, schools or labs, and so on. That's a debate, and to me, it's a bit surprising that these funds pop up here and there at a time when there is so much money floating around. So that it's a bit related to the management of potential conflicts of interest. And I think it's also important that MIT doesn't become like a machine to churn up startups, but sticks with its objective of educating students, members of its community, to develop an entrepreneurial mindset. And with this mindset, then not everybody needs to be an entrepreneur, of course, but students, graduates will opt for an entrepreneurial career and others not. So whether they work in a venture or in government or in corporation, with this entrepreneurial mindset, they'll be change agents where they are. And such change agents are clearly needed today, given the problems that the world is facing. And certain sectors, for instance, certain sectors of the economy, of society need to be disrupted to solve the huge problems that the world is facing. And the world, as we know, the clock is ticking.
So that leads into one of the questions that we have coming in from the followers today. And I want to remind everybody that if you have a question for Jean-Jacques, please just go and click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen and then type a question in and it'll get relayed to me. We have a question coming in about the money focus. So Jean-Jacques, when you were researching the book, did you come across faculty or administrators or students who were concerned perhaps that too much focus on entrepreneurship might in fact, distort the mission of the institute? And if there's this focus on creating unicorn billion-dollar companies, is that automatically healthy for an educational institute? And how long can you sustain that focus when your real mission is educating students? Did you ever talk to folks who were of two minds about all that?
Yes, of course. It's a debate, and I think it's a healthy debate. As long as there is such a debate, it's a good sign that the institution is cautious about staying close to its mission. I myself, I'm concerned, more broadly speaking, that maybe entrepreneurship has become too fashionable. The danger is that sort of being fashionable, there is too much money going on in funding weaker projects, and that presents the risk that the pendulum will go the other way, and that some good projects will not be funded. And as I said earlier, at a time when the world needs them to solve the big problems we are facing. But on the other hand, MIT is making a big effort, for instance, with the engine, to develop what we call deep tech startups that need a much longer pathway to market, and that is a little bit at the opposite of creating the billion-dollar unicorn, etc. So I'm fairly optimistic, but it's a debate and it's a healthy one.
Yeah. I don't mean this in a self-promotional way, but you'd mentioned the engine, and I made a whole episode of my podcast soonish about the engine, and I just think it's a fascinating place, led by really brilliant people and funding brilliant people. And you know, just one example of a company that the engine is supporting is Commonwealth Fusion Systems, which is born out of the Plasma Science and Fusion Center at MIT, and you know, is as close as anybody in the commercial world to proving that it's possible to build an economical tokamak reactor. And you know, they've chosen materials for the superconducting magnets that could make it possible to bring an energy positive, you know, a net positive reactor online in as soon as 4 years. So it's kind of amazing, and that single innovation could actually go way beyond unicorn stage. We're talking about a potential trillion-dollar company, right? If fusion were to reach the stage where it could be commercialized and could come online and power everything else. So yeah, some of these swings that MIT is taking are very, very large indeed, and it would be sad to see that effort undermined by I don't know, the shifting dynamics of venture investing. I think the engine's probably going to avoid that because they have a structure to support long-term investment, right, over the course of well more than a decade. Some of these companies will take a long time to get to market, and the engine is set up to do that. Okay, that's my little speech. We have a question that's more of a history question coming in from the audience. The gentleman says, in the early 1990s, I asked Chuck Vest, then president of MIT, about starting an incubator at MIT. And he said, MIT's business is education and research, not incubation. Now, of course, a lot has changed since then, but when precisely do you think MIT actually changed its position to the point where it is now formally fostering incubation and a whole bunch of other aspects of startup creation? Is there a moment you can pinpoint, or is it more of a general shift in mindset?
Well, I think our vision might be a bit influenced and biased by the fact that we talk a lot about entrepreneurship nowadays. But I think fundamentally the position of MIT has not changed really, in spite of the appearances. I think entrepreneurship still is a byproduct of education and research. The major difference is that there has been a lot of demand from the students for training and yes, basically training and preparation to this potential new career. That seems to a lot of them more exciting than the alternatives. But and MIT still doesn't have an incubator. really, no, I don't think we can call the engine really an incubator. So it's a separate entity, and it's very focused on these deep tech technologies. And the idea is to compensate for market failure, since venture capitalists don't fund this kind of projects, or didn't.
Okay. I want to get through as many of these questions as we can. Let me just go back here. So here's a question. A lot of the entrepreneurial enterprises coming out of MIT are based in specific fields of expertise like AI or life sciences. So a heavily technical or scientific background. How important is it for these technology experts to pair up with business experts or management experts? And is part of the magic that MIT works that it has ways to pair these people up so that people can come together from both sides?
Yes, that's very much the case. I think one of the great success in entrepreneurship education at MIT has been early on to combine students with different skills, and typically students with a management background with students with a science and engineering background. And nowadays, most of the extracurricular activities and courses, at least the practice-oriented courses, must be taken as member of a team and of a multidisciplinary team. So that has been a key factor of success, absolutely. Was there another part of the question?
Well, no, that was the question. I mean,
that was the question, yes.
Right. That,
yes, and by the way, just to add one thing, is that there is a long tradition at MIT in research education of multidisciplinarity. So I think this helped apply this multidisciplinarity, multi-skills teams in entrepreneurship education.
Okay. Here's another question. So an audience member says, I left my job at a Fortune 500 company to head up R&D at an MIT spin-out. It's been a wonderful experience, and I continue to work for the spin-out well after a very successful exit. It's been my observation that gaining skills and experience at an established company before an entrepreneurial career has had some advantages over coming straight out of school into a startup. So what is your advice for new MIT graduates who aspire to work in management or in startups? Is it better to go into a big company first and get some experience there in that environment before you venture into the far less predictable world of startups?
Yes, well, that's also a debate, but I think that gaining experience is probably a good idea, whether it's in a large corporation or a younger company. Having examined a lot of business plans and listened to a lot of pitches, mentored a lot of entrepreneurial team, one of my strong views is that entrepreneurs, founders need to really know their industry inside out. And in order to gain this experience, you probably need to go work for a company or companies in the industry of interest.
Right. Okay. I think you're right. Here's a question. Have you seen the time between idea and commercialization stage, or between prototype and commercialization stage, change during the timeline of the story you're writing about? So the book basically covers the period from 1970 to the present, roughly. Has company creation accelerated during that time? And if so, what are the largest drivers of that change?
I think so. I think that company creation has accelerated. And I would attribute this to the infrastructure that students or other members of the community with an entrepreneurial project have at their disposal. As I said earlier, more than 60 classes, more than 80 extracurricular activities. Really, this helps you get up to speed compared to decades ago when there was almost nothing.
Okay. Here's a question that will draw on your long experience working in Europe, Jean-Jacques. So, what, in a way, this goes back to the original question in your book. So, what is it about the MIT culture that makes it different from other universities when it comes to supporting entrepreneurship? And specifically, could you compare MIT to European institutions?
Yes. So I think that the magic, in the sense that, sorry, happened at MIT is that elements of its culture were, you could find elements of its culture, the same elements in entrepreneurship. Let me explain this. For instance, obviously excellence. Excellence is a core value at MIT, obviously. But excellence is critical in entrepreneurship as well, as illustrated by the high failure rate of startups. And so same with problem solving. It's very strong at MIT. The first thing an entrepreneur needs to do is identify a problem that has not been solved and build a solution that is commercially viable to this problem. Again, experimentation is core to MIT's culture as well. It's core to the scientific endeavor. But entrepreneurship is trial and error, is testing, is failing and starting over again. So it is also experimentation to a large extent. So what happened, and is fairly unique to MIT, is that this correspondence between elements of its culture and critical elements of entrepreneurship, which helped members of the community to make the step towards entrepreneurship relatively easy. I think it's much more difficult in an organization or a university that is siloed and top-down and very rigid, and where there is little multidisciplinarity, for instance, as we alluded to today. So I think that's the part of the first part of the question. The second part of the question, how does it differ from Europe? Well, of course, it's a big generalization. Europe is big, and I would talk primarily of continental Europe. Well, I think most of these characteristics that I just described, you seldom find them in European universities that are more ivory tower, siloed, and where it's the problem solving having an impact on the real world, science, but science as at MIT science, but not necessarily for the sake of science, but for the betterment of the world, is not really very much present in European universities. Of course, that deserves much more developments, but in a nutshell, that would be my answer, my
Mhm.
quick answer.
And that's probably also the nutshell answer for why all of these governments and universities that send delegations to MIT to study the MIT magic and try to go home and recreate it almost always find that it's much harder than they thought, perhaps because they don't have the fertile soil at home.
Yes, exactly,
right?
exactly. And I think a lot of them come with the expectation that they could copy and paste the model. I go out of my way in the book and in my talks not to present MIT as a model for others to copy, but rather as a case or a case study that could trigger interesting conversation locally in Europe or elsewhere to discuss how to adapt things that have worked well at MIT in the local context and adapt them and adjust them to the local context. Much more than a model to cut and paste.
Right. Well, just a quick final question. We only have a couple of minutes left, but we do have a question coming in about comparing MIT to going in the other direction to Stanford. I don't know how much, I asked a question earlier about, whether MIT shapes its own strategy around competing with Stanford, but this question is more about whether, you had time in your research to study what kinds of structures exist at Stanford. So what are the major differences between the way the two institutions support entrepreneurship?
Well, the short answer is no, I didn't do it.
Okay. Fair enough.
A big challenge in writing a book or a thesis, or it's to put boundaries. And I decided to write a book about the case of MIT and not make a comparative study. So
Right.
I left this to another author.
Yeah.
to do.
Well, one big difference, obviously, is that Stanford has the world's largest concentration of venture capital firms right on its doorstep on Single Road. So an undergraduate can basically cross the street and raise $10 million overnight. Well, we have those too. They're just out in Waltham, and they're not right across the street. A few of them are, of course. Okay, I'll stop. We are out of time, and Jean-Jacques, this has been a real pleasure, and it's been great to catch up with you and just immerse myself in the book. And we went back and forth in the run-up to this event, and had a lot of time to think about these themes. And I really have enjoyed learning from you about this, and I hope that the audience will go out and pick up the book. So I'm going to say thank you, and I'm going to thank the Boston MIT Club for this opportunity, and I'm going to hand it back to you.
Thank you, Wade.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, Jean-Jacques and Wade. That was a really great overview of the entrepreneurship atmosphere at MIT, and thank you again for the for accommodating our Eastern Daylight Time, Jean-Jacques.
Welcome.
Yes, one of the great things about one of the unexpected advantages of the pandemic is it gave us a big incentive to suddenly embrace remote talks and virtual events. We're a lot better at it now than we were at the beginning. And it's great because it means that, yes, we can have speakers and participants from all around the world, and not just the Boston area. For those of you who are in the Boston area, I hope that you will feel comfortable joining us next month in person at the Harvard Club with Professor Linda Griffith. And more information on that, including the COVID protocols, will be forthcoming very soon. And I'd just like to remind everyone, check out the MIT Club of Boston website for a full listing of our events. And and the book From the Basement to the Dome is available wherever fine books are sold, or you can just look at the MIT Press website also for links and ways to purchase. And just like to say thank you all.